Member for Hastings. The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Watson.
Thanks very much, Deputy Speaker. I've got to say I find aspects of this debate like entering an alternative universe. For people to come to Parliament where you look at the different challenges that are happening across Australia and you choose in different ways the victims whose cause you will champion, and different people on both sides of the House will find people genuinely in need. But to have a situation now where there is a core group of government MPs where the victims who they want to most champion and look after and try to help them from their plight are racist people who are not allowed to say enough is one of the most, possibly the most bizarre thing I've ever seen in my time here as a Member of Parliament. Any law, when you look at amending the law as this committee has considered, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens from whatever the starting point is already. So anything that involves changing the language of Sections 18C and 18D of the Racial Discrimination Act isn't an amendment that just says, OK, let's just imagine something to be consistent with other pieces of legislation. No, no, no. It changes where the threshold is now and allows things that are currently not permitted to be said, to be allowed to be said. And that's why I've repeatedly during this discussion, not just today in the Parliament, but as this has gone on and dragged on for months and years, continued to pose the question. If you want to change the threshold, what is it that you want people to be allowed to say that they're not allowed to say already? Because in any amendment to this section, the courts will give meaning to the amendment. And if the intention is to allow more so-called freedom of speech, then they will allow things that are currently not being allowed to be said. Now, it's no good for those opposite to say, oh, well, it's a Bill Leak cartoon in the situation of QUT students, because it's already been determined that those cases were not an offence under the Act. And that's been agreed. So changing the threshold does nothing for things that are already not caught by the Act. Has nothing to do with it. So people can come and make as many speeches as about Bill Leak and the QUT students as they want. All they are doing is defending the current legislation. It's an argument in favour of some of the recommendations that come through this report about streamlining processes, and Labor will have a constructive approach to streamlining processes on any piece of legislation, on any tribunal, on any court. But to say that Bill Leak and QUT are the problem when it's been explicitly agreed that Sections 18C and 18D combined mean those examples aren't caught by it, therefore adds nothing to the debate. What we have seen from a number of the speakers is something that is hard to describe in terms other than self-entitled, born-to-rule arrogance. That's what we've seen. Because most of us who've spoken in this debate, not everybody, but most of us who've spoken in the debate, and me included, will go through our entire lives in Australia without ever being targets of racial abuse. It wasn't the case of people of my heritage 100 years ago, but it's been the case for a while. We will go through life without experiencing racial hatred targeted at us. And the main way we see it is when we're in a public space we might witness it, or more often for many people, it's when something's happening on a train or in a shopping centre and someone thinks to video it. And what we see and what we are horrified to see is something that for many Australians is their lived day-to-day experience. And that's under the current law. So for people who say, it's just words, we need freedom of speech, it's just words, words can't harm you. Tell that to the woman who goes home in tears after being abused because of the way she's dressed on a train. Tell that to the child who goes home trembling after they've witnessed the treatment that their parents receive in a shopping centre. Tell them it's just words. These issues are real. And those opposite, it's not everybody opposite who argues this case, but those opposite who argue that it's just words Don't argue the same when we're talking about defamation law. Don't argue the same when we're talking about whether or not a whistleblower should be allowed to state what has happened within a government department. They don't argue the same when we talk about whether or not an employee should be able to tell their story if there is an employment contract that said they weren't allowed to. They certainly don't apply the same principle of it's all about freedom of speech when a non-government organisation reaches a contract with the Commonwealth Government and part of the contract is to prevent them from speaking out. So why do they suddenly find freedom of speech when it involves multicultural communities, when the person who will be harmed will never be them? And that's why Labor will never support any amendment to the Racial Discrimination Act where the outcome of that amendment is more racial hatred. We will never support a lowering of the benchmark in the name of consistency with other acts, because the courts will have to give meaning to it, and the only outcome will be more racial hatred in Australia. We keep hearing from the Prime Minister and others, and we hear it from members of the opposition, we hear it from crossbenchers, and it's a good thing when people celebrate that we are the most successful multicultural country in the world. But it doesn't happen by accident. It happens when members of Parliament prioritise the person who might be the target of racial discrimination over the bigot. When we prioritise the person who will receive the abuse over the person dishing out the abuse. This entire debate has been brought to the Parliament because we have a little ginger group within the Liberal Party party room who want to prioritise the abuser. How on earth does anyone look at the vision of someone being abused on the train and think the person we need to help is the person dishing out the abuse because they just weren't allowed to say enough? When you have a society of people with many cultural backgrounds, there are three ways you can organise it. And it's just, I use the image of how you organise food. If you separate your ingredients on the table, you've got a segregation model, and no one's proposing that. When you whack everything into the blender and expect it to come out with a puree as some sort of soup, then you've got an assimilation model, and we do have members of the Parliament wanting that. When you create a salad where every ingredient's allowed to keep its own integrity and you get a national flavour out of it, you've got a multicultural country. You've got a multicultural Australia. And that is what used to, even under the years of the Howard government, the Fraser government before them, and certainly Labor governments, was viewed as a right and decent vision for Australia. But now we have an Attorney-General describing there as being a right to be a bigot. We have members of the Liberal Party party room seeing the key victims they want to defend in our society as being the people who just aren't allowed to say enough racist things. Well, don't think the megaphone that people are offered in this Parliament isn't loud. It's really loud. And the people who need our help and protection hear what's being said. And the people who want to extol their bigotry and undermine people for their race, for their cultural background, for their heritage, they hear what's being said here as well, and they are armed by what's being said here as well. Our words matter, and the words that are said in the public square matter. And the words that are said on the train, on the bus, on the tram matter. And the words that are said in the shopping centre matter. And we should never, as a Parliament, look at the levels of racism that come from a small minority in this country and say we want to let them say more.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member